Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar organized by SADEGEO. Transport accounts for approximately a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union and is going to play an important role in the European Union new emissions reduction target by 2030 and its climate neutrality objective for 2050. The Green Deal establishes that in order to achieve climate neutrality, transport sector emissions will need to be reduced by 90% by 2050. In this regard, the European Commission recently presented its Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy, which aims to put European transport on track for the future. The objective of this seminar is to examine the required legislative changes to decarbonize the transport sector in line with the 2030 and 2050 targets. Second, to analyze the role of synthetic and advanced alternative fuels from renewable energy sources in reducing road, aviation, and maritime transport emissions. And finally, I would say in summary is to discuss how to decarbonize transport in line with the European Union climate neutrality and a higher 2030 target. To cover these topics, we have a great panel composed by three outstanding experts coming from the European Commission, the regulator, the energy sector, who is responsible from wheel to tank emissions, and the mobility sector, who is responsible from tank to wheel emissions. The first presenter is going to be Matthew Baldwin. Matthew is the Deputy Director General for DG Move, and he's also the manager of the Commission mission for 100 climate neutral cities by 2030. He's the European Union Coordinator for Road Safety and Sustainable Urban Mobility, and he's also managing the Commission Crisis Network of COVID-19 transport contact points. He also has had extensive experience within the European Commission in several roles in DG Trade and DG Move. The second presenter will be Berta Cabello. Berta is the Energy Efficiency and Decarbonization Process Leader of Repsol. She is responsible for developing new projects to transform refineries into low-emission sites. As you all know, Repsol is committed to become a net zero energy company and has a clear path for it. And the third presenter is going to be Jonas Stromberg. Jonas Stromberg is the Sustainability Director for Buses and Coaches at Scania. He coordinates Scania global activities on sustainable public transportation. He has had also previous experience in aviation and railways, and Jonas set up in Stockholm the largest worldwide fleet of sustainable buses, 2,300 buses at that time, powered with waste from the city, a circular economy solution. So what we would like today is to have a very interactive discussion and dialogue with the presenters, rather just a series of presentation. We will start with a 10-minute presentation by each of the presenters. Then we will have a round of questions to the presenters and a discussion around relevant topics. Then the audience will be able or have the opportunity to send their questions to the panelists through the chat functionality. So be prepared for sending your questions and we will ask those questions. And finally, we will end up with a headline from each of the presenters. So let's start this, I hope, fascinating debate with Matthew Baldwin. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ivan. Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. And thank you so much for inviting me to this fascinating looking webinar. And it's right on theme for us here in DG Move in the European Commission. As Ivan explained, I've got different hats I'm wearing at the moment. I'm particularly focused on things like sustainable urban mobility and road safety. And of course, our exciting new cities mission, 100 climate neutral cities by 2030. But today's a great chance for me to learn a bit about some of the developments going on more broadly in the sector to tackle climate change. And thanks, Ivan, also for mentioning upfront our sustainable and smart mobility strategy, because this is where we are really setting out our new policies. Let me try to summarize quickly for you how that would work. The essential thrust of it is that we're aiming to make all transport modes sustainable. Less focus on modal shift from less sustainable modes to more, and making everyone sustainable. We recognize the second point, that that's going to take some time. So we also need to make sure that in the meantime, there are some alternatives available to some of the less sustainable modes. And that, of course, also to give ourselves time to build those new fuels for things like aviation and shipping. And in the third place, we need to make sure we incentivize those alternative modes. It really is a massive undertaking. You gave some of the figures already, Ivan. We are looking at a 90% reduction in transport emissions from the transport sector by 2050. At the same time, it's the only sector at the moment where climate emissions are still growing. So it is a monumental shift. And indeed, as we note in this, we have to shift from this notion of piecemeal, incremental change to a fundamental transformation. And it's going to be necessary politically, because of the also note in the strategy that greening mobility is the new license for the sector to grow. Right in the headlines at the moment is a broad group of measures which will also address transport, which we're calling the Fit for 55 package. What's that referring to? Well, of course, it's the intermediate 2030 target of reducing our climate emissions by at least 55% by 2030. This includes several initiatives aimed at accelerating the decarbonization of transport, including, firstly, the revision of the CO2 emission performance standards for cars and vans, the revision of the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive, as well as the alternative fuels initiatives for aviation and maritime to help both of these sectors decarbonize while remaining competitive. And I'd like to say a word about those. But specifically when it comes to road transport, the existing policy framework is already driving the zero emission uptake, thanks to the current CO2 emission performance standards, the current Clean Vehicles Directive, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and other instruments. But we're conscious that we have to do much, much more. Given our targets under the European Green Deal and the sustainable and smart mobility strategy, we need the pace of transition to increase substantially. So we're aiming to have at least 30 million zero emission cars in operation on Europe's roads by 2030. By 2050, we want to see nearly all vehicles on our roads to be zero emission, including cars and vans and buses, and of course, new heavy duty vehicles. If we're going to meet those objectives, we're going to need more ambitious emission reductions for road vehicles as part of this review of the CO2 emission performance standards under the Fit for 55 package, as well as the revisions of the AFID, the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive, qualitative and fully interoperable recharging and refueling infrastructure in order to boost the uptake of the cleaner vehicles and vessels. I think the AFID revision is going to be a fascinating challenge. The game here is to ensure through strengthened requirements that we have sufficient and fully interoperable recharging and refueling infrastructure in all member states to support this big uptake of low and zero emission light and heavy vehicles. What we're calling recharge and refuel, it's our European flagship of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. This means meeting the objective of having 1 million new refueling and recharging points in operation by 2025, already announced in the European Green Deal, and we're pushing ahead with that. Beyond road transport, as I mentioned, we've got to make sure that the transport modes have these meaningful alternatives to decarbonize their operations. By 2050, we've got to see a massive deployment of alternative fuels and clean options for planes, for ships, and for trains, as well as increased efficiency in their operations, which is why we're going to come forward with 2 further initiatives. It's initiatives all the way at the moment in the Commission to help decarbonize aviation and maritime transport. Firstly, refuel EU aviation, what we're calling the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Initiatives, and fuel EU maritime, green maritime space. Again, both of these initiatives focusing on the sustainable, renewable fuels in these transport modes. Over time, we also need to establish a much more robust regulatory framework to drive the uptake of these sustainable alternative fuels. We need to give a bit of market certainty to the people who are investing in these areas, making investment in production capacity more attractive. And we need to have harmonized rules across the EU to enable the successful transformation to take place. And last but not least, if we're going to accelerate the growth in volumes, we're going to probably need some form of strategic value chain alliance for boosting the uptake of the alternative fuels. Whilst all these measures are addressing new vehicle registrations and infrastructure, we've also got to do more to push consumer behavior. So we're investigating possibilities for improving carbon pricing through a revision of the emissions trading system, the famous ETS. We're already assessing of how EU ETS for aviation and CORSIA, the international agreement through the ICAO, will interact in the future. We're planning to extend ETS to maritime, ensuring compatibility with any future global market-based measures. And we're also looking at extending ETS to road transport as well as to buildings. So we're going to be busy. We're going to be keeping you busy. Really looking forward to our discussion here this afternoon to exchange some ideas about the way forward. And thanks again for asking me.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It was impressive, the ambitious target that you are setting for the good of the society and the cities and the air quality and so on. It is clear that the European Green Deal is here for real, and that even though Commission could have backup down because of COVID crisis, you are fully on. So when I see the speed limit behind you, I don't think for this there is any speed limit. On the contrary, I mean, you are free to rush into the transformation of the mobility sector in Europe, no? So congratulations.
Absolutely. You put your finger on a good point there, Ivan. I mean, it would have been very easy to back down during the COVID time. I mean, if you think the president, her State of the Union speech back in September, where we thought at that time we were just coming out of COVID, the economy is in tatters, and a lot of people were saying, well, she has to give the economy a breathing space, keep the old modes going, because we can't put more pressure on. And she didn't do that. She said, we're not backing down. This is our new growth strategy. We have no alternatives. It's the new license to grow, and we've got to go down that road. There really is no alternative. And by the way, we know we can do these things because we've tested them rigorously in impact assessment. Some people would like us to go further. Some people would like us to go a little less far. But what we're putting on the table is achievable. We're very confident of that.
Yeah, I like what you say in terms that in the oil and gas sector, we used to say that we are looking for a license to operate, no? And here you are mentioning something that is much more important, is the license to grow, because this is going to be a growth sector for many of the players that we are going to be facing around. Let me ask you one specific question. I mean, that I'm sure the audience will be interested in knowing more. I mean, why is the Commission abandoning modal shift as the flagship policy?
Well, I mean, this was the basis on which we had our last big transport strategy built around. And the idea, for example, that we'd shift freight from the road sector and onto inland waterways and onto rail. And what's happened, goodness me, how hard we've tried, is that in fact freight has moved in the other direction. It's moved off rail and onto road, for example. And the reasons for that are complicated, but it's very clear that if we just try to kind of cross our fingers and hope and push, we're not going to get there. We need this fundamental transformation. So in that sense, modal shift as a policy takes second place now to ensuring, particularly in terms of freight, that we make all our freight transport sustainable as quickly as we can. We just have to try to shift gears in this.
Good. And how does this relate to the urban mobility dimension? And I think Jonas will also talk about urban mobility later on. But I mean, what is your opinion on that?
Well, great. It's sometimes seen as a sort of a different world out there, the little world of urban mobility. And it is true that cities and towns can often lead these transformations politically and in terms of energy efficiency and lots of other ways. They have the capacity to lead much more substantially. Let me put it this way. If we can reduce our dependence on the use of privately owned, conventionally fueled cars in cities, and I think we are talking predominantly just in cities for the moment. I mean, it's going to be a reach to do this outside cities. And we might be doing that for all kinds of reasons, but particularly for carbon neutrality, we can get incredible co-benefits that flow from that. If you do that, you improve your air quality, you get less congestion, you reduce your noise, you have fewer deaths from road crashes, and you have more people cycling and walking, and you generate a snowball of positive health effects. And ultimately, what you end up with is more livable and more lovable cities. So how do we do that in the broader transport context? We're going to strengthen the urban nodes in the 10T directive. That's the plan, so that you get more advantages to being an urban node in the system, but probably you're going to face more requirements too. Indicators to drive down your climate emissions, indicators to measure your road deaths, and trying, if you like, to not have urban mobility play off on its own, but to see it as a properly integrated part of our overall transport system through the 10T directive. So ambitious goals, but again, putting my other hat on, if we're going to have full climate neutrality by 2030 in 100 cities, you simply can't do it without mobility.
Good. Thank you. So we will enter into our further discussions when the debate. Now
Look forward to it. Thanks.
Now let's switch to Berta Cabello, who will be representing the energy sector in this equation.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for inviting me to this very interesting session. Well, I think some of the things that Matthew said were very interesting. In fact, I think that technology and innovation thrives in crisis situation, and we have to take advantage of this COVID crisis to push technology developments further, to be able to go ahead with our decarbonization, because it's key. I think one of the challenges we have right ahead is technology. So let me show you, I'm really happy to be here today to show you briefly our contribution to carbon neutral transport. Our sites, our industrial sites, are going through a transformation process. We are progressively changing our feedstocks from crude oil to other feedstocks, renewable waste, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is give an alternative for our products that are mainly for the transport sector. We want to make them carbon neutral. And we also want to be a solution for waste that is really a problem in cities and in some sectors like agriculture or the food industry. And of course, we also have to change the origin of our energy. It has to be more renewable, but of course, it has to be into efficient processes, because the first thing we have to do is to be more efficient in the whole supply chain. So currently, we are already producing biofuels around 700,000 tons per year, but we are going to increase that production dramatically. And also, we have reduced, we have avoided around 2.5 million tons of CO2 emissions from our processes in the last 10 years. And this transformation is in line with European climate ambition, but it's also aligned with the really nice, I love them, sustainability targets from the UN 2030 agenda. And the thing that I like most from these targets is that they told us, and Matthew commented before, we need to make strategic alliances around the value chain. We think the energy sector cannot do this thing alone. We have to count on with upstream sectors that will give us the waste, also with technology sector, and also with our users. That could be Jonas, for example, but also the people that are really demanding to us this change. To give you the lines in which we are focusing, there are 4, because we count on all the different technologies that we can get. First, energy efficiency. Second, renewable gases. Also, low carbon liquid fuels. And finally, CO2 capture and use. If we start with efficiency, as I commented before, for me, it comes before an efficient use of resources, before changing it to renewable origin. So we have a very long culture of efficiency, that we also bring it to other companies, even our family and friends, and we think that is key. And in the last 30 years, we have increased our efficiency quite a lot. We have a challenging way ahead, but we think that with innovation, we can go further. The second line is renewable gases. We will produce hydrogen from electrolysis and also from reforming of feedstocks coming from waste, like biogas, bio-LPG, bio-naphtha, and we will also produce that biogas. I like this line because it will help us decarbonize our sites, but also we will deliver these products to other industries, to homes, and also for the transport sector. The third line is low carbon liquid fuels. Right now is a key enabler for the decarbonization of the existing fleet. It gives a solution right now, but also will be key for other sectors like marine and aviation in the mid and long-term future. And finally, CO2 capture and use is a solution not only for our sector, but other industries. And it has a very interesting potential because combined with renewable feedstocks, it can achieve negative footprints. So let me give you 4 brief examples of this transformation plan that we have. The first of all is that we have a final investment decision has been already made for a new advanced biofuels plant in Cartagena refinery. It will start up in 2023, and it will produce 250,000 tons of advanced biofuels for the road transport, also for aviation, and it will also produce biopropane and bio-naphtha that could be used for the chemical sector or to produce renewable hydrogen. The second example is that we announced in February that we are now shareholders of the company that owns a technology to produce bioethanol from urban waste. And we are now in the engineering phase to scale up this technology and integrate it into our refineries. The third one is a project that we have in Bilbao refinery in the north of Spain. We are doing the engineering studies for a demo e-fuels plant that will take the CO2 already captured in the refinery, and with hydrogen coming from a new electrolysis unit, will produce these synthetic fuels that, as you know, can be used in the existing fleet also, and also in aviation and in the marine transport. The last one is a little different. It's a pyrolysis plant that will produce biosyn gas from urban waste, and this gas will be integrated into the refinery as energy and also to produce renewable hydrogen. This technology also needs some scaling up, so we will start with 10,000 tons per year, and we will finish with 100,000 tons per year. And well, these are only a few examples of a bigger transformation plan. We have right now 5 refineries in Spain, distributed across the country. They are an integrated system, one of the most competitive in Europe and the most flexible. The contribution we make to the regions in which we operate is quite significant, and we want to keep on contributing to those regions, not only as we do now, but more. It's the license to grow that you were commenting before, promoting also circular economy in those regions and technology development. And we think that our industry is one of the best to do this transformation, not only because we have the sites, the infrastructure to make it more efficient, but for me, the main reason is because of our team. We have a great team. We know how to develop technologies. We know how to engineer, make engineering, build, start up new units, and also operate them with safety, reliability, efficiency, and also taking into consideration environmental protection. So I'm really proud to be a member of this team, and I can assure you that my colleagues and I are up to this challenge. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Berta, for this very good introduction to what Repsol is doing. I must say that in many instances, the oil and gas sector is being demonized. No, many people believe that they are part of the problem. And what you have shown during your short presentation is that you are really an active part of the solution, and that the transformation of the business you are conducting will help to speed up. I mean, and again, this no speed limit that we should have in front of us will speed up the decarbonization of the transport, and is totally complementary with other solutions. No, so something that we may discuss later on is around technological neutrality, no, and how we can make sure that we put all the efforts together to go into the decarbonization of mobility, which is extremely important. No. The one question I would like to ask you is about the transformation you are conducting in your own refining sector into low carbon system processing, renewable feedstocks, and technologies. No, but which are the main challenges that you are encountering to achieve this transformation? Because it's not
Thank
an easy
you.
one, I understand.
No, it's not an easy. I think as an engineer, it's very, very nice to be in this challenge. But I mean, the first one is technology. I mean, these technologies are still under development. Some of them need scaling up. So we need to work to make them feasible technically, and also in terms of profitability, of course. But we think, as we commented before, we need to push and we need to promote them to be able to make them ready and more efficient, of course, because right now some of the technologies, like, for example, hydrogen production coming from water, from electrolyzers, we have already technologies, but they have to be more efficient and in the future. So we need to invest on them to do so. And the second challenge for me is the market itself. We need to create the market for those new products. We are talking about a lot of them. This HVO, for example, that is a substitute for diesel, biogas, renewable hydrogen. And in order to promote the market at the beginning, regulation is key. So it has to be there. And for example, in the case of renewable hydrogen, in the beginning, we as an industry will consume that hydrogen and will reduce the footprint of the products. But at the same time, that market into final uses need to be developed. And it needs to happen during the next 5-10 years to be a real solution.
So in summary, technology, market, and regulation are the three levers to achieve your aggressive and really ambitious transformation of Repsol refinery schemes to better serve the mobility. So thank you very much, Berta. And now we switch into the third presenter, Jonas Stromer from Scania.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you very much for inviting us here. It will be really interesting, and a big thank you also to all the positive energy that we got actually from the two previous speakers. I thought it was really encouraging to see what's going on, and I do sincerely believe that cooperation, particularly between the transport sector, the energy sector, and decision makers, is really key for making this transition happen. And I will now for 10 minutes just whiz you through some of the possibilities and the challenges for the heavy duty transport sector to decarbonize. As we heard already mentioned, I mean, we are a little bit of the bad guy in the transport sector. Most other sectors are already on the path of decarbonization, while we struggle in the transport sector. And particularly true is this for us in heavy duty, because as we know, we have to halve our CO2 emissions every decade, basically, in order to reach the Paris goals and to reach the ambitious targets of the European Union. This is a big challenge when you start from a point where you have actually 95% fossil oil in the transport system, which is the case then, particularly for us in heavy duty. And looking also at the long lifetime of the vehicles, I mean, an average bus and truck operates for around 30 to 20 years. And that makes it an even bigger challenge to achieve this halving in only 10 years. It also tells us actually that we need not only to get a lot of new vehicles in, we actually also have to replace the energy and the fuel in the rolling fleets. We need to replace the fossil diesel with biodiesel and HVO, and we need to replace the natural gas with biogas, for instance, also in the rolling fleets, if we should reach our target. Very low penetration so far of electric vehicles, particularly for heavy duty. So how can we then in the heavy duty sector even think of achieving this goal of halving CO2 emissions in 10 years? Well, the good news is that there is so much existing commercial technology available for doing this already. I mean, this is something we have been doing at Scania for over the last 20 years. And we also must remember that in heavy-duty transport, it's fully commercial. It's not cars, and sometimes it's a bit of a mix-up here. I mean, your ordinary car you would use for around 5% of the time. Many of the heavy-duty operations, as you know, will operate 24/7, day-round, in very, very heavy applications. So for that reason, there will be no silver bullet for decarbonizing heavy-duty. We will need a lot of different solutions for different types of operations. Typically in the lighter operations, if you like, within inner cities and so on, we can see that electrification will happen already this decade, also for heavy duty, typically for buses and smaller trucks. But for the longer runs, for the trucks, for the long distance buses, the intercity buses, but also in the suburban tougher operations, we still see that we will need the liquid biofuels, and we will need the hybridization and also the clean gas solutions. But the good thing is that these technologies actually are here already. Really important to remember what I just said also. We need to make these solutions so competitive that they actually can outcompete diesel, because this is fully competitive business and a very low margin business for operators. If it will cost you 1 euro cent more per kilometer to operate, many of the operators will be reluctant to change. And this is really a key to understand as well. I will look into a little bit of a deep dive into one of these technologies, one of the solutions that is maybe a little bit forgotten. It's a bit of a Scandinavian secret, if you like, and that is biogas or biomethane. And what is that? I mean, basically, it is organic waste that you have turned into methane, which is the same molecule as natural gas, only by speeding up the natural decomposition process. And if we put this in numbers to make it more concrete, if you take the sewage and the organic waste from 1,000 citizens, you can actually power a bus for a year. And that shows you the potential in this. And of course, biomethane is not only doing that, because not only will it give you a clean fuel, it will actually create a lot of local jobs within the waste sector. It will clean up your city, it will remove your landfills, it will clean up your water, but also produce biofertilizer that can replace fossil fertilizer. So there are lots of win-wins in this biogas system, truly a circular solution. And in Germany, where we have a lot of the biogas and the big biogas sector, we see that over 100,000 jobs actually are created within this also. If you look globally, though, it's a bit depressing, because over 90% of all organic waste globally actually goes straight into the ground, straight into landfill. In Scandinavia and in Sweden in particular, we have worked with this for over 20 years. So we are in a situation now where we have no landfills left, where all organic waste is turned into biogas. And that means also that 95% of the gas in our vehicle gas system is actually biogas from waste. There is a great potential to do this elsewhere also. And as we can see on the map, the biogas is actually spreading a bit from Scandinavia also to other countries. On average, we are on 17% if you look at the gas used in transport, 17% is actually biomethane today, replacing fossil gas. So that is good. Unfortunately, on the south of the map, we can see that beautiful Spain, hosting us today, actually has very little biogas going at the moment. But there are, great potentials here in Spain for doing that, because you have a big agricultural sector and a big livestock sector, maybe even the biggest in Europe. And estimates have shown that you could produce, over 30 terawatt hours of biogas just by using the waste in this sector. And also we can see that when we look at this from a Scania perspective, we can see that in 2025 already, 50% of the trucks, the gas trucks in Europe, could actually be powered by biogas, because the growth is now so big. So this is a very hopeful solution, I would say. And biogas is also important because it has a real big CO2 emission cut from a well-to-wheel perspective. And this is really, really important, because we still tend to have a lot of focus on tailpipe emissions. And it is only real emissions that counts for the planet. So a well-to-wheel perspective is something that we desire to see a bit more of in policy. And when we do that, biogas will come out on top, because it always has a very, very high reduction from a well-to-wheel perspective, over 90%, and can actually even be negative emissions at times. Just to show you a little bit from Sweden, we are the country in EU at the moment with the highest decarbonization of the transport sector. We have decarbonized 29% of the transport sector so far. And again, a little bit also, as you saw from Berta, we can see that there are three key tools really for achieving this decarbonization. It is making the transport system as such much more efficient. Still, if you look at most of the trucks, they run 50% empty, and we still have too many people in cars that we should shift to public transport. So that is a big part of the decarbonization. Electrification, of course, is coming along, but it will not really kick in until maybe after 1 decade or so. So on top of that, we need the biofuels and we need the waste to fuel to make this happen. And you can see actually that these three chunks are almost equally big when you look at the decarbonization process. We aim to be at 70% cut in 2030. And just coming back to biomethane and biogas, just to give you an example of how big it can actually be, it's definitely not a silver bullet, but within the Swedish heavy-duty transport system, we use around 20 terawatt hours today. We have 4 terawatt hours of biogas in the system, and we expect to have around 7 in 2030. And that would mean that around 1/3 could actually be powered by waste, which is not a silver bullet, but it's a great chunk of decarbonization. And we know, of course, that this is possible, and it is possible everywhere, because at Scania, we are operating these type of solutions on all continents, actually, and outcompeting diesel also. One example, of course, from Stockholm is where we have 100% fossil-free operation in the capital region of Sweden on all buses, and we've had since 2018. And also, this is actually now being introduced in Spain, and just showing in the middle there a nice biogas-powered bus operating in Zaragoza today. So this is definitely possible, and it is possible to do it everywhere. It is actually not very difficult, as we say, as long as you try to focus really on getting and achieving real well-to-wheel CO2 emission cuts, because that is what counts. And then to keep in mind that we really have to implement the existing commercial solutions at the same time as we are pushing for the innovations. And that is sometimes not always easy to keep in your head, but we need to do both to get to Paris in time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonas. I like very much this final comment around getting to Paris in time. It's a good punch. And it is clear that you mentioned the three key tools for decarbonization of heavy-duty transport: increased transport efficiency, biofuels, and electrification. And we need all of that. This is not either or, this is and, because what we need to achieve is the full decarbonization of the
Yes, definitely.
You also mentioned something that I like very much, is that, we are moving from promises to reality, no? and you were at some point managing the Stockholm mobility sector. And what was that made it possible for Stockholm region to achieve 100% fossil-free transport?
Yes, I mean, I still think it's a good example, and I would love to see all cities doing that. And I'm really glad to hear about Matthew's initiative of making more cities totally fossil-free. I think cities they are very often in the lead when it comes to this. I find cities being well ahead of nations or EUs or other political bodies, really. But what happened in Stockholm was, you could see that traffic was causing a lot of the CO2 emissions. So what was put was a functional goal. Basically, in the year 2000, it was a functional goal put that we should have 100% CO2 reduction in 2020. And then there were a lot of milestones put on the way. Where should we be? But the focus was, as I mentioned, also on well-to-wheel emission cuts and how can we get as much CO2 cuts as possible for every euro spent. So it was a very functional approach. It was not looking at different technologies or even specifying technologies. And that basically led to a case where different technologies were used in the inner city, and for the more longer operations outside of the city, there were different other technologies used. So it was addressed in a very sort of functional and commercial way, focusing on real CO2 emission cuts. So how to get the most CO2 cuts for your money spent. And on top of that, I have to say, we also had, it would not have been possible to do this in a commercial way if we didn't have the Scandinavian CO2 taxation in place. It's been in Scandinavia since the 1970s. And that really helped, because then there was actually an incentive for the low carbon energy forms, regardless of energy form. There was an incentive for low carbon energy, be it biogas or biofuel or green electricity. So in the end, we could actually operate these vehicles at the same cost per kilometer as diesel. And once we got to scale, I should say, it was not possible in the beginning, but once we got to scale. And I like to say in after COVID times, we always invite anyone to come and have a look, because seeing is believing, and it's quite nice to see that all vehicles in the city operating fossil free, and this is possible anywhere.
Good. It's reality, and I hope many cities will follow your path. I have a final question for you before we enter into the debate on different issues. It's something very specific. Is the Vector tool, who is the main tool for following up decarbonization of heavy-duty transport in Europe, is enough to achieve the high goals of the European Union that Matthew was mentioning at the beginning?
Yeah, we are really happy that the European Union is putting these tough targets. I think I really love that Europe takes the lead here. It's great, but we really need to step up also when it comes to, because measuring is important and following up is important if you want to get things done, as I'm sure you all know. And Vector, for those who don't know, that is the tool that follows up heavy-duty transport, and it's sort of used as the decarbonization tool. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, this tool is only looking at tailpipe emissions, and that is really not supporting in real emission cuts. And it also leaves out then the possibility for great and really commercial technologies like biogas that we talked about, for actually prove that it can achieve, over 90% CO2 cuts and sometimes even have negative emissions. That doesn't really count when you look at the tools we are using today. And I see, unfortunately, similar indications in the taxonomy coming out now that we see that there is a strong focus on technology rather than functional CO2 emission cuts, which is what we should look for, particularly on a well-to-wheel basis. That is the foundation. The planet only cares about well-to-wheel, not about tank-to-wheel, right? But I'm sure that will be fixed, but that is absolutely important, because otherwise we will actually rule out a lot of good technologies that could help us here and now.
Good. So thank you very much, Jonas, for your presentation. Now, all three presenters have had an opportunity to convey their main messages on this very interesting topic. Now, I would like to start with some issues for debate. And the first one is something that has been mentioned in some of the presentations, which is around circular economy. And I am a strong believer in the need for circularity in our economy. So what role do you see for circular economy in order to achieve carbon neutral transport? So Anyone can start.
Let me go ahead.
Yes, please go ahead, Berta.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we have a lot of carbon in our world. And as Jonas said, the important thing is the global well-to-wheel emissions. And if we want to make something of value about carbon waste, we need to put this into the value chain. And I think that biogas is a great example. Also, renewable hydrogen coming from waste is also a good example. Other liquid fuels that can be made also with waste. So I think it's a good way to decarbonize transport and at the same time solve a problem that, for example, as Jonas said, in the livestock sector, waste from that sector is causing methane emissions in origin. So if we convert that to fuels, we can reduce that footprint as well and help that sector. So I think circular economy is key. Yeah.
I can just add to that and maybe moving a little bit outside of Europe as well. I mean, to give an example, if we can use waste, and as I mentioned, I mean, over 90% of the organic waste still goes in the ground, causing a lot of environmental problems when leaking into the atmosphere. Actually, if we can utilize this waste, that is a great way of actually achieving financial viability, also sustainable transport. And that was a little bit what happened in Stockholm, because we could use the waste to power the vehicles. And then I will not say that the waste was free, but combining then transport policy with waste policy and circular economy policy, you can actually make both great transport solutions and waste solutions financially viable. They really support each other financially in this way. And these are discussions that we have had, particularly in growing cities in developing countries, where there's a great need both for more sustainable transport and for solving the waste problems. And here you can actually make both of them financially viable by combining them. But very often we look in silos. We try to solve one problem in a silo rather than the other. But once you look at this, and that's why it's so important that we work together with the energy companies, but also with the waste sector, and then also with the decision makers, because we need good waste policies. It was only when we banned putting organic into landfill and put a gate fee on that, I mean, that's when it suddenly turned into financial viability for also powering sustainable transport.
Just to join in. I mean, I think sometimes there's a risk in these things that we all tend to agree with each other too much. But it's a great question, and the answers from Berta and Jonas are completely right. The circular economy can and will play an increasing role, and the examples you've given are really terrific. We'll be looking at that in the context, by the way, of the climate neutral cities, because we want to put it to cities to say, where are you struggling? Is it on waste management, or indeed finding ways to get your products of waste into the engines of buses? I mean, we're ready to try to help whichever way across all sectors, and that's very much an emblem of the city's mission. Maybe to look for something to slightly disagree with, I mean, which I think is always important in this, to pick up what John is saying, and I'm no expert, but I'm told that sometimes if we put too much emphasis on well-to-wheel, for example, we can actually rule out some advancements just on zero tailpipe emissions alone. The studies we've done on the zero emission vehicles at tailpipe are things like battery electric, a hydrogen fuel cell, also bring quite substantial benefits from a life cycle perspective. So we wouldn't want to have them sort of ruled out. I mean, they are already, in terms of their greenhouse gas performance, I think 2 to 3 times better than in terms of performance than diesel and petrol vehicles. And I think as the share of renewable electricity increases, of course, we can expect to see them bring even further improvements. That all said, as we review our CO2 emission standards, we will look into options in which we can introduce well-to-wheel emissions in the relevant legislation. It's a lot of practical things to bear in mind, but this would indeed ensure that we can really try to make sure that all the relevant emissions are taken into account. I guess it is, in English, we'd say, let not the best be the enemy of the very, very good, if that means we can bring down emissions in the short term. And I love Jonas's parallel of let's get to Paris on time, but that cannot mean waiting until 2049 and then suddenly becoming perfect. We've got to make progress while we can along the way, as fast as we can. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I like that we are in a sense creating a more nuanced answer to all these questions. No,
but I'm still agreeing with Jonas. Don't get me wrong.
No, I know. But the nuance is always good, no? And I mean, when we're talking about these, I was remembering when I was talking about electrical vehicles in China. I mean, in fact, reality is that electrical vehicles in China are just coal fire or coal fuel cars, no? And when we're talking now about buses in Europe, we're talking about waste powered buses, which is a good thing because of the circular economy. No?
But that's a great parallel. If I could pick that up, Ivan. I mean, just on that particular point, I mean, you hear that quite a lot from people, don't you? That, I would get an electric car, but I'm just not sure about the source of electricity, or the source of the power. And our message tends to be, don't worry about it. Get the vehicle, and let the regulators and the changes that are afoot take care of themselves. The worst case would be that people think they're doing the wrong thing and getting an alternatively fueled vehicle, whether it's hydrogen or electrical, because they're worried about the source. And I think it's up to us to fix those problems.
I agree. And the one very important thing is that we really need to rejuvenate the car fleet. We have a very old, very high emissions, low effectivity car fleet in Europe and in certain countries. No? Good. So let's switch to the second question, which is also a question that I have seen is a big debate in certain places. No, decision makers tend to focus on specific technologies for decarbonization. And my question is, does this hamper the implementation of clean and low carbon transport or not? So what do you think?
I can comment quickly, but I think in a way, yes. If you only focus on one technology, that will rule out some of the good alternatives, and I think that is also why we talk a lot about the well-to-wheel focus. We have to look at sort of real emission cuts, but we must also push the development, as we have heard from all of us here. So I think, one example is, I think the Clean Vehicle Directive, for instance, is a nice sort of compromise. We love compromises in Sweden. That's what we do. And there you actually allow all technologies, but at the same time, you're also pushing for new development. That is what you have in the Clean Vehicle Directive, because you have a mandate to push also zero emission in. But if you only focus on zero emission, you might end up in what you mentioned. If we look at hydrogen, for instance, today, it is still quite dirty and still quite costly. So I think we really need to have the balance of doing both the implementation of the commercial ones and pushing the new at the same time. And that is a delicate balance, particularly for decision makers to do. But a good example is the Clean Vehicle Directive. And the bad example is, of course, the vector tool and maybe a little bit what we see in the taxonomy at present, because I think everyone would be able to do a Stockholm, if you don't mind me being a bit nationalistic here. If we just had a very clear functional view.
I see Matthew raising his hand.
Yeah, for as long as Sweden continues to deliver on emissions reduction, on road safety, you can be as nationalistic as you like, Jonas, in my book. But to pick up the very good question, Ivan, and I'll also see that Jose Garcia Casanovas is asking similar issues about this. We, as you probably know, maintain studiously our technology neutral policy that markets should decide the way forward between zero emission alternatives. As far as possible, we shouldn't see battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell as competitors, but complementary. We will see, I think, in the short run, quite a strong uptake in terms of battery electric cars and vehicles and buses. But it's certainly in the long term, hydrogen is a very promising solution for long-haul trucks and waterborne shipping and for buses and coaches. And we've been funding for a long time, as you probably know, this thing called the Joint Undertaking for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells, and will continue to support the sector. But now we think it's time for the automotive industry to really get its feet wet and to bring the vehicle models to market. We've also last year, if I could refer you, this is like a one non-stop advertising campaign for Commission initiatives, I know, but last year we published a thing called the Hydrogen Strategy, which defines in a lot more detail all the different planned actions that we have to promote this key element of our overall decarbonization strategy. So I don't play golf, but someone said you should never try and play golf with one club, and hydrogen is a very valuable new club.
Good. I don't play golf either, but we are now getting questions from the audience, and maybe we should start with there is one from Juan Marrero, who says, which will be the role of LNG in the maritime sector transition to decarbonization of maritime and shipping? So who can take that one? Berta, maybe? Matthew? The role of LNG in the maritime sector transition.
I have to confess, if you're punting in my direction, I'm no great expert on this. But all I know is that it's playing an increasing and very large role. I'm privileged to visit the amazing facilities up in Rotterdam, which I think was at the time, and I think it probably still is, the largest site of high pressurized LNG fueling. And I think the sector's embracing this in a very big way. And I think, again, back to my terrible golfing metaphor, we're going to need to play golf with a number of clubs, including in the decarbonization of the maritime shipping, and LNG absolutely has a role to play. Sorry, that was general.
I'm not an expert on LNG, but talking maybe about one thing that we were commenting in the last question, about some technologies that could be seen as a transition technology, because sometimes LNG could be seen as a transition, but that can help decarbonize in the short term. I think that the beauty of also waste to fuels is that most of those technologies can have a use in the short term, and with a little downstream process or downstream tick can reach other solution at the end. For example, biogas can be used directly, but it also can be used to produce hydrogen, or even bioethanol or other waste to fuels options, or the other way around. Some technologies that can produce hydrogen from waste can finally go into the marine sector by making synthetic fuels. And I think that's more flexible than the industry that we currently have based on crude oil, that it has all the products at once. In this case, I'm seeing the beauty of the process and the technology that can help us short-term solutions and long-term. It's not answering the LNG question, but it is true that LNG is also, I think, a solution in the short term that can help decarbonize, of course.
I can do a quick comment. I mean, we see that LNG, and then especially if we then sort of add the bio component to that, biomethane, what we call LBG, to this, is really a key for decarbonizing, at least in this first decade, until 2040 or so, particularly long haulage, heavy duty. And as we have seen with the growth of biogas production in Europe, we believe that over 50% of the 150,000 trucks that we expect operating on gas in 2025 could actually then operate on bio-LNG, if you like, or LBG as we call it. And then maybe in a couple of decades to come, when also long haulage trucks actually will electrify in a bigger extent, this fuel will still be needed, particularly in maritime, I would say. So there is still a big business for this fuel around. So, I mean, it's a transition fuel maybe for road transport, but it will definitely be needed then later in maritime. So it's definitely not a need to phase it out either, because we will need it.
We have one final question related with EU regulation coming from Jose Ramon Serrano. And he says, in this moment, EU regulation tank to wheel in transport doesn't allow that low carbon fuels in well to tank can count for transport decarbonization. He says, any comments from the panelists?
We can comment. I mean, it is really important that we actually already from the beginning take into consideration the life cycle analysis of the batteries, because there are challenges. It is very clear. We have engaged with the Northvolt production of batteries, and that will actually have at least 50% recycled batteries in a decade to come. But I think this is quite important. It is more of a challenge, I would say, for vehicles not operating so much, if you look at the carbon footprint, particularly cars, because I mean, as I said, the car is basically sitting in the street. It's operating for 5% of the time. And then it will take a longer time, actually, to remove the carbon footprint of the battery. But if you look at our operations, where you have 24/7 operations, there is a carbon footprint from the battery, and we are working very hard to make it smaller. But we will more quickly sort of eat up that carbon footprint, because we replace a lot of diesel while using the electric solutions in this case. But it's a very important question, and it cannot be neglected. I think it's really important. Same goes, I would say, for the existing fossil fuels. I tend to see that all green alternatives gets more scrutinized than others. But when you ask about oil, it's usually coming from Rotterdam and nothing else. And then batteries are just good all over. I mean, I think it's important that we do the life cycle analysis for everything we do.
Yeah, well, I can be very, very short. I mean, you've asked a question on EU regulation. I'm afraid I'm not, Jose Ramon, a sufficient expert in the specific question you put, but Jonas, I think, has answered it extremely well. I think over time, we're going to try to do much more of bringing life cycle analysis into the discussion. I refer you to the answer I gave a while ago on tank to wheel, wheel to well. Well to wheel, goodness, and you'll get it right eventually. Well to wheel emissions, and investigating that side of things. But again, we can't let the best be the enemy of the good, and we've got to try to advance as best we can. Thanks.
Good. So, in interest of time, I would like to ask a final question. And for that final question, I wouldn't like long speeches, but just a headline, a tweet even. And the question will be as a summary. What is needed to achieve carbon neutral transport? So maybe starting by Berta. And by the way, Berta, I noticed something very, very nice in your video about the Repsol refinery. I noticed the number of women that were present into the video. And that's a great thing, because, I mean, we need to incorporate more and more women into the refining industry and in general into the energy sector. So what will be your headline for what is needed to achieve carbon neutral transport?
I think all alternatives are needed if we want to speed it up. And we have to consider all industries, because I think we all together can help in this challenge.
Good. Jonas?
Yes, I still believe, I mean, a clear focus on, well-to-wheel emissions when it comes to procurement and policy is really key. And do not forget that the waste from 1,000 people can actually power a bus for a year.
That's a good quiz for the future. 1,000 people can power. Let me give you another one. I mean, one coal plant, 1,000 megawatts coal plant is equivalent to the emissions of 5 million cars. Matthew, your headline or your tweet?
Well, I certainly will take that 1,000 figure to mind. I can remember statistics better than I can remember names and basic facts, that's for sure. I think the point I would stress is what a broad undertaking that is. And I think, as Berta said, ultimately, we're going to need all modes to be sustainable. I think in a democratic society, we're not about banning or preventing different alternatives. That means the market's got to play a role, and increasingly the market is driving us faster and faster towards the correct alternatives, if you like, on climate change. But in all facets of our economy, of all types of mobility, on all modes, we've got to get there. That means both action in the short term and the long run, looking ahead to investment to make sure that all modes become sustainable. And then not being afraid, I finally would say, to use the market system to incentivize those alternatives, to make sure that we are internalizing those external costs and really making sure that we have a proper user pays and polluter pays systems. That way, I think we'll get there.
So it's less about restrictions and forbidden, it's more about incentivizing and creating
Exactly.
the right mechanism.
And you say this to certain people and they say, are you crazy and you're green? And you say, no, we're using neoclassical economics to solve this problem.
Good. So thank you very much to our three outstanding presenters. I mean, it has been really engaging and nice to be chatting with you for these 1 hour, 10 minutes. And I just would like to remember the audience that our next webinar will be on the 25th of May, and it's going to be around hydrogen. The title will be The Road to Establishing a European Hydrogen Economy, something that I saw some questions in the chat, and you will have the answers in the next webinar. So thank you very much. Enjoy the day, and let's aim for as soon as possible decarbonization of mobility in Europe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks a million.
Bye.
Bye.